Hi and welcome to A British Audiophile. For those of you who don't know me already, my name is Taryn. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the Willsenton R8 tube amplifier. This is another product that is sold directly by Lee at China Hifi. It retails for $890 on their website. You then have to add import duties and shipping charges. I think here in the UK you're still likely to get it on your doorstep for inside £1,000. And for that reason, I think it's going to appeal to people who traditionally perhaps may not consider tube amplifiers. I know you can get those cheap hybrid tube amplifiers on eBay and Amazon for a couple of £100, but they're a different kettle of fish. To get something with this kind of architecture and construction, you're normally looking at £2,000 or £3,000, and the cost sometimes can be a prohibitive factor. The other thing that puts some people off tube amplifiers is living with tubes. And that's again something that I'll address in this review. So let's see if this Willsenton R8 is the bargain it's cracked up to be. The Willsenton R8 is 40 centimeters wide, that's 15 3/4 inches. It weighs a whopping 26 kilograms, that's over 57 pounds. Most of that weight is in these 3 transformers, which can be a good indication of quality. You turn it on by rotating this dial here. There are 4 LEDs that indicate input selection, and that final LED indicates the mode of operation between triode and ultralinear. Don't get too excited by that dial, it isn't a VU meter, it's there to indicate the bias adjustment. And then there's a button to switch between the triode and ultralinear mode and the input selection. The volume control has a nice smooth feel. It comes with a substantial metal cage to help protect the tubes. They get quite hot when in operation, and if I can just show you the supplied remote control, it's an all metal affair with buttons for input selection, to adjust the volume up and down, to mute the device, and also to switch it between triode and ultralinear modes of operation. On the rear we actually have 3 line level inputs and a pre-input that allows you to use this amplifier as a power amplifier. If you've got an 8 ohm speaker, you connect it across here, and if you've got a 4 ohm speaker, you connect it across here. There's a switch here that allows you to switch between using EL34 and KT88 tubes and an IEC power socket. Let's talk about how a tube amplifier works. There's different types of tubes, and the most basic type of tube would be a diode with 2 elements, hence the name diode. Now let's just imagine that this 6SN7 tube in the center is a diode. It isn't, but it'll work for our illustration purposes. What essentially happens is that the bottom element, the cathode, is heated up to release electrons. Electrons are negatively charged. They're then attracted to the positively charged anode. What a diode does is it only allows the current to pass in one direction, effectively changing AC current into DC current. And that's essentially the function that this 6SN7 tube here is performing. A tube with 3 elements is called a triode, and that's what the 67SN is, a twin triode tube. The third element is called a control grid. Now the architecture is a little bit different on this tube, but if you can imagine a metal grid literally running through the middle of this tube, the way it works is by actually varying the amount of voltage on that control grid, making it more positive or more negative, you can influence the electron flow across the tube itself. Making it more positive would attract more electrons to the anode, and making it more negative will repel more electrons back to the cathode. And that's the basis of an amplifier. A large output signal going out which mirrors the small input signal coming in. There are tubes with 4 electrodes, they're called tetrodes, and the 4th element is called a screen grid. There's also tubes with 5 elements. That's essentially what the KT88 tube is. It's a pentode. And the 5th element is called a suppressor grid. And what those extra elements do is improve the efficiency of the tube, allowing more electrons to pass more effectively from the cathode to the anode. There are many similarities between how a transistor amplifier and how a tube amplifier work, but there's also some significant differences. One of the significant differences is that tube amplifiers operate at much higher voltages. Your solid state transistor amplifier may have an internal voltage of somewhere between 60 and 100 volts depending on how powerful it is. Tube amplifiers regularly use 500 volts. Tube amplifiers have 3 stages of voltage amplification and voltage gain, and that's what these two 6SN tubes here and here are doing for each channel. There's the pre-amplifier gain, and then there's the driver stage gain or driver amplification. And the KT88 tubes at the back are part of the power amplifier gain. Another significant difference are these 2 additional output transformers. And what they do is they step down that very high unsafe voltage to a much safer voltage to connect to your speakers. And because of Ohm's law, when you step down the voltage, you also increase the current. That's also necessary to drive speakers. Another benefit is that they actually lower the output impedance of the amplifier, which is what you need to drive a low impedance load like a loudspeaker. The Willsenton R8 is a big ballsy sounding amplifier. It throws out a wide soundstage and certainly has more soundstage depth than other amplifiers I've reviewed below £2,000. That's right, up to double the price. And that includes the recently reviewed ATL IN200 Signature, the Exposure 2510 that I reviewed a few months ago, and the Hagel H95 that I currently have here on long-term loan. Let's start with the bass. It has a real mid-bass punch and plenty of extension. A little bit overdone, perhaps for some, but I think the vast majority of people will find it really engaging and dynamic in nature. It gets your toes tapping. Certainly got my toes tapping. Okay, it trades a little bit of bass speed for that weight, but I wouldn't describe it as slow, just well judged. Those fireworks continue into the mid-range. So many amplifiers I review have a thin sounding mid-range around this price and way above. My Hagel H160 retails for almost 3 times the price of this amplifier, and it has a thin sounding mid-range, but not the Willsenton R8. Just play a saxophone or a trumpet on your system and see what sounds like the real thing and what sounds like some cheap process facsimile. The Willsenton passes this test with flying colours. Okay, so there's real body and texture to the mid-range, but the background's quiet enough to allow the leading edges of notes to reveal itself and for there to be a nice decay structure present as well. The separation of instruments within the soundstage is also very good, and it's clear where you can locate instruments, whether it's front to back or left to right, certainly competitive with the best amplifiers I've heard up to a couple of grand. Where something like the Exposure 2510 and the Hagel H95 to a lesser extent hit back is in terms of mid-range refinement. There's a slight hard edge to the mid-range on the Willsenton R8 that reveals itself, especially in the upper mid-range when you're connecting it to very revealing speakers like my ProAct Response 1 SEs or the ATC SEM 19s. The high frequencies are nicely extended. It has that airiness on top that many people desire and helps with the sense of spaciousness and immersion. Sibilance is fairly well controlled, but this is an area where the Hagel H95 and the Exposure 2510 shine. They have that extra degree of refinement. I should stress that my comments relate to listening to the R8 in ultra-linear mode with the stock KT88 tubes. I felt that overall that offered the most balanced performance across a wide range of speakers and a wide range of genres. But that isn't to say that I preferred that mode of operation in every instance, because that isn't the case. In triode mode, I felt the bass control wasn't quite the same, the highs were a little bit more rolled off, and the overall clarity suffered a little bit, but it was a little bit more harmonically rich. Take my ProAct Response 1 SEs as an example. When listening to simple jazz or acoustic music, I preferred it in triode mode, but when listening to more complex rock or classical music, I preferred it in ultralinear mode. What mode you'll prefer will depend on the speakers you partner it with, the type of music you're listening to, and your own personal taste, but it's nice to be able to flick between the two with the switch of a button. I did try some tube rolling with the R8, switching in the optional EL34 tubes. Now the romantic in me would love to report that I preferred the EL34s running in triode mode, but that wasn't the case. There was a little bit of added warmth and harmonic richness, but I felt it came at the expense of bass control and overall clarity, and it was a compromise too far. Running the EL34s in ultralinear mode was much closer to the sound that I achieved with the KT88s running in triode mode. So my advice is that unless you like an overly warm sound, stick with the KT88s. Now for those tube aficionados out there, I'd remind them that running a pentode in triode mode is not the same as running a single-ended triode amplifier with triode tubes like a 300B. That's perhaps why I preferred the KT8s in this particular instance. For those of you who haven't had tube amplifiers before, there may be a few things you want to consider. One thing is that tubes can be microphonic, which means they can work like a microphone, turning vibrations into sound energy itself through your system. So if you've got a tube amplifier, make sure it's on something stable. The tubes themselves get pretty hot. Not hot enough to burn you, but certainly you don't want to be in contact with them for more than a second or so. So make sure it's well ventilated, and if you've got little fingers around, make sure it's out of reach of them. Then there's the life of the tube itself to consider. Most tubes will last from between 1,000 to 5,000 hours of operation, depending on the tube itself and how hard it's driven by the amplifier. Don't let that put you off in terms of buying a tube amplifier. Replacement tubes these days are quite cost effective due to the fact that there's quite cheap tubes available from China. But I would certainly be switching the amplifier off when it's not in use to prolong the life of those tubes. The tubes are really easy to install. Everything's individually labelled on the amplifier itself, as well as the supplied tubes. You just match them up and push them in. Hopefully you can see that if I've zoomed in close enough. You have to be a little bit careful that you're not too brutal when you push them in, otherwise you could damage one of the pins, but I think you're going to be absolutely fine. And I have to say that this amplifier comes superbly well wrapped. Everything's individually insulated to a really high standard, including the amplifier itself. Other manufacturers should really take note. Those 4 larger power tubes have to be biased, which means adjusting the operating current. The other tubes are self-biasing, and that's nothing to worry about either. It's really straightforward to do. There's a bias adjustment control here, and all you do is flick the switch down to the tube that you want to adjust, hold it down and place a flathead screw in the appropriate hole and adjust it until the needle on the front hits the center of the display. The same for V2, and over this side you have an identical adjustment for V3 and V4. It's a beautiful looking thing, isn't it? The R8 played superbly well at low listening volumes and also at moderate listening volumes, but I did notice as I started to turn the volume dial up close to the 12 o'clock position, the sound hardened up and by quite a bit. So I don't think it's really suitable for those who listen at very loud volumes unless they've got really efficient speakers, something like a horn-loaded Heritage Line Klipsch. To tell you the truth, I had a lot of fun with this amplifier over the last month or so. It's been hooked up to every single speaker that's been through here. I've already spoken about my Proax, which it drove fine. So let's talk about some of the other speakers I tried out with it. The Fine F700s are a warm, rich sounding speaker, and that classic combination of a horn tweeter and a valve amplifier works superbly well. If you don't want to spend $2.5 grand and 500 quid is more your budget, in a small room, the Sound Artist LS35A again has a warm balance, and that worked really well with the R8 as well. If you want something more dynamic with a cooler tonal balance, well, the Amphion Argon ones are my go-to reference around the £1,000, £1,200 price, and they'll do very nicely with the R8. Their big brother is the Argon 3S, currently in for review, with naturally a similar tonal characteristic, but with more scale and dynamics, another successful pairing. Quite frankly, the Willsenton R8 has plenty of driving capability at low and moderate volumes, and also has a fairly balanced, if not totally neutral tonal balance. They'll make it suitable to use with a wide range of speakers. The Willsenton R8 is going to appeal to those people who are looking at more exotic tube amplifiers, but for whatever reason they're out of reach, and also those people looking at their first tube amplifier. It looks superb, it's built superb, and quite frankly it sounds superb. It's the best amplifier I've heard for this side of £1,000. Quite frankly, it's one of the best amplifiers I've heard for less than £2,000. Hell, if it had a little bit more refinement and played a little bit louder, I'd consider putting my Exposure 21 Pre and 18 Super monoblocks up for sale. It's that good. I think you can see where this is going. the Willsenton R8 gets an outstanding from this channel. Well, that's it for me for today. I hope you liked this review. If you have, please hit that like button, please share it. And if you like what I'm doing with this channel, please think about subscribing. And don't forget to check me out on Patreon, where you can support me financially. Check out some of the consultancy services I offer and also some of the Patreon only videos. But for today, for now, a British audiophile signing off.